If you're interested in politics in a country with an election coming up, you live in suspense and you look at public opinion polls. In the United States, public opinion polls make big headlines, but lately they've also been making big mistakes. Pollsters led a lot of people to believe that Hillary Clinton was headed to the White House. But Donald Trump did better than they expected in 2016, and he did better in 2020 as well. In 2022, in the elections to the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, Democrats did better than the pollsters predicted. In all three cases, people said then, and they're saying now, polling in the United States is just plain broken. Chuck Coughlin looks at the polls along with the rest of us and joins us now. What do you think? Is something wrong? Are the numbers wrong?
Well, the interesting thing to think about is they're only wrong when they're wrong. And we've had a lot of close elections in Arizona. In the country, we've had a lot of very close elections. So there's always a margin of error with all polls, depending on the sample size that you use. And that usually most of these races are within 4 or 5 points of each other, which means you're within the margin of error on most polls. That's sort of my initial disclaimer on polling. It's good up to a point, but in very close races, yes, you can have problems. I go beyond that with a little bit more insight. So here we do polls, and what we call is we cultivate a list of known voters. We know we're talking to voters. So when I'm calling somebody, I'm calling and I'm asking to talk to X. I'm not saying, hey, are you a registered voter? I already know that by the list that I'm working off of when I get, is this John? So I'm calling what I know to be a registered voter with a voting history. So I know, because we're calling a voter list of known voters. And so I'm filling quotas, because then we project based on history who will turn out in any given cycle. And so like in this cycle in Arizona, we expect 36% Republicans to turn out, 32% Democrats, and 28% other. So then I'm looking to fill quotas on age, geographic region, all of those things when I'm filling quotas to come up with my universe. That's not how everybody does it, though. So what often happens in these bigger national polls is they'll call and say, hi, are you a registered voter? Well, and people lie. They say, of course I'm a registered voter. Or they're calling a registered voter list. But as we know, in most elections, almost 20% of registered voters don't participate. They have no history of participating. So again, in a close election, these kind of things are going to throw you off on your accuracy. And so when I look at polls, I always look at the demographics, where they're getting their demographics. Are they calling registered voters? Are they calling self-admitted registered voters? These are the kind of things in a close election that you have to pay close attention to.
Okay, you've covered a lot of ground, so I want to just make a few points that you made a little bit clearer. You can poll, you can ask questions of all Americans. You can ask questions of voting age Americans. You can ask questions of registered voters, and that's different than voting age Americans because a lot of Americans don't participate in the electoral system and they aren't allowed to vote, they aren't registered to vote. And then you can ask questions of likely voters who are not just voting age Americans or registered to vote, they are people who the pollsters consider, as you mentioned, likely to actually turn out to vote. And so if you want to be an informed reader of polls, I guess you've got to watch very carefully who got asked the question.
Yep, that's exactly right. And then even under likely voters, is that a descriptum that is assigned, are you a likely voter? A lot of people will say, yeah, sure, I'm a likely voter. But unless you have a voting history on that respondent, you don't know, right? So you want to know who you're calling and who you're talking to, particularly with all of these races so close. My favorite quote as a former campaign manager who was often trailing in the polls was, hey, what do you think about this poll? I said, well, the only poll that counts is the one on election day. And so, those are the ones that actually count, that people turn up and vote. And so that's what you really have to pay attention to. But these other things that you can look at can help you discern, what is accurate, what's not accurate, what's, plus it. And again, it starts off with a margin of error. Everybody has a margin of error in these things. And so it's within 4 or 5 points to begin with. And then it can get wider depending on those types of who you're calling, how are you vetting that audience, what do you know for electoral turnout.
Okay, so you mentioned the margin of error. In a lot of polls, it's 4%, and that's plus or minus 4%, which means any number is really within a spectrum of 8 points. 4% down, 4% up. So right. A lot of polls that look like politicians have a clear lead over another politician, that lead is an illusion, isn't it?
Well, it's usually accurate. I mean, it's usually accurate, but within the margin of error, the scientific margin of error. And I'm a liberal arts major. I hire mathematician. The guy who does our polling here at High Ground is a math major, and I hired him for that very reason, because I'm not qualified to make these decisions. He does the math, and so that's exactly right. And so generally, if you're close, and we've been really good out here. We've called Arizona elections, which have been very, very close over the last, since 18. We've been on the money with everything that we've called in Arizona. Again, because we're calling voters. When we talk to voters, we know who they are. We know we're filling quotas based on what we believe turnout's going to be. Now, that's a guess. A turnout is an educated guess as to who's going to turn out. I mean, we know this cycle, there's a lot of discussion about younger voters being less enthused. There's talked about, Hispanics who tend to be Trump voter, the older Hispanics that tend to be Trump voter. I mean, these are all quotas that you got to look at in a survey.
Okay. Who you ask, how you calculate the numbers. Also, you got to look at the calendar, right? Again, if you want to be an educated student of polls, does it make sense to take any poll seriously that's conducted in May or June or July for an election in November?
No, it's a snapshot. That's a great question. It's a snapshot in time. It's like taking a photo of what I look like today and saying, how close is that going to look like, 6 months from now? You don't know. It's a snapshot of that period in time, and we all know. So here's a great example of that. So January of 2020, we would have all said, Trump's a lock. He's a lock to win re-election, right? The economy was rolling. Everything was great. Things were doing really well. And then February, COVID, fumble, mishandles, becomes very cantankerous with the media, begins all these homebrew theories on how to solve the problem, lost the confidence of the public. Usually in national elections or in national emergencies, the country tends to circle around the executives to come together. The country comes together in a crisis. That didn't happen. That did not happen in that crisis. And so it completely changed the matrix of that election from where, I would have bet my house that Donald Trump was going to win that cycle because the economy was going great, the stock market's going great, the world was a pretty stable place at that point in time. And it's just, one of the things that becomes a thing you have to look at in terms of what is going on at that given point in time.
Okay, so we're learning all of these things to be cautious about if you're reading about a poll or hearing about a poll. National polls, are they any use at all in the United States, or should people ignore them and just pay attention to swing state polls?
The media loves polls, right? It's something to talk about. It's something that drives the narrative. We've seen all of this narrative recently on this Siena poll that the New York Times did, that all of these swing states where Donald Trump is ahead, the left, totally gets upset by that. But it's a timing. It's the timing of it now. And it's those very issues which we talked about in terms of who you're talking to. And, I've made this point with several people talking. I'm like, it's a long way away from the election. things can change, and who are they talking to? The other thing that I think is important here is the national narrative. So I find the country to be in a pretty bad mood. And generally speaking, that they have a very negative mood of the country. Well, Trump's narrative is pretty much following that discussion. It's a negative narrative that he's following, versus where the incumbent president, you're trying to be optimistic, you're trying to be hopeful, you're trying to be aspirational. And so that negative narrative has a different effect than a positive narrative. We all know negative messaging has a longer shelf life. It's an easier sell than a positive message. Positive messaging is more difficult to talk to people about because it takes longer. You have to encourage them. You have to create an environment that can resonate with. That's a challenge for the Biden administration right now. I mean, I was reading in the New York Times this morning. There's an article, big editorial in there about the economy, and how the unemployment is like at a record low for like the last, I don't know, years and years and years. Inflation has come down substantially. The stock market's over 4,000. You're kidding me. Everything should be great. But the country doesn't see it that way right now. And so there's a disconnect in all of that too, that you have to wade through this stuff to try and figure out, what the country is really feeling like. And that just comes with experience in watching this kind of stuff.
So let me ask you, when you wade through the polls, on the basis of the polls you've seen now, do you think you know who's going to win?
Well, I go back to a very simple measure here that I've used myself in Arizona. I don't know about the rest of the country. I can tell you about Arizona. I can tell you honestly about Arizona. And what I do know is this, back to that initial number that I gave you, that the turnout will be 36% Republican, 32% Democrat, 28% other. That 28% other, that element of the unaffiliated voters in Arizona has determined who wins Arizona since 2016. Trump won that cohort in 2016. He's the last MAGA candidate in an Arizona statewide ballot to win that cohort of voters. 2018, Kirsten Sinema won them. 2020, the president won them with Mark Kelly, our senator out here. In 2022, Mark Kelly was back on the ballot. That was filling John McCain's original seat. He won it again. And all the Democrats that were running for governor, secretary of state, and attorney general all won that cohort of voters. So I have a rule for Arizona. You cannot win Arizona without winning a majority of unaffiliated voters. Because a successful campaign out here, having run them, you have to hold 85 to 90% of your own base. So if you're a Democrat, you got to win 85 to 90% of Democrats. You're a Republican, you have to win 85 to 90% of Republicans. And then you have to win a majority of that other vote. I have not seen that happen out here for a MAGA candidate since I said in 2016. So if I go by history, if I go by what I know, I say to myself, Biden's going to win. I just accept that as a rule. There are things that make me question that. There are things that call me into question on that. That would be the enthusiasm gap. Presidential election cycles tend to have a larger turnout because younger voters turn out in much higher percentages than they do in a off-cycle election. And so we're expecting that to happen. Is that going to happen? Do younger voters experience some malaise? Are there lack of enthusiasm for the president because of his age? Do they go, I'm not in on this, I'm out, I'm just going to skip the ticket? Does that also happen in other demographic groups? Because nobody likes this matchup. Very few people are like rooting on these two older gentlemen to have a repeat of what happened in 20. So do you have I have a big question. I don't think this will happen, but I have posed it to people. So we have a reproductive rights initiative on the ballot in this cycle. it has gotten a lot of attention in Arizona. I have never seen an election cycle where the presidential ticket receives fewer votes than anything down ballot. I'm wondering, does that happen this time? Because of the unpopularity of both Trump and Biden, do people show up and say, I'm done, I'm not voting for that, I'm going to go down ballot, I'm going to vote for something else? I don't think that'll happen, but you have to acknowledge that's a possibility in this cycle. So these are questions that we don't know because, as I said earlier, the only poll that counts is the one on election day.
Chair Coughlin, thanks so much for this.